Do you still remember the names that once kept America awake at night? The kind of names whispered in diners over coffee? Printed in black ink that stained your fingers? The faces that stared back from wanted posters curling on gas station walls? The 1950s and 1960s weren't just poodle skirts and rock and roll. They were the decades when crime wore a human smile, when every town had its own legend of danger, and when good people learned how thin the line was between safety and chaos. You grew up hearing the echoes, neighbors locking their doors, your parents lowering their voices when the evening news mentioned a jailbreak, a killing, or a name that suddenly didn't feel safe to say aloud. But somewhere along the way, those names faded, the world moved on, the headlines yellowed, the fear turned into folklore. Tonight, we're pulling those names back into the light. The ones you almost forgot, but your bones still remember. Let's start with one that once made mothers clutch their children a little tighter, Charles Starkweather. You might not know the name anymore, but in 1958, he was every parent's nightmare. A 19-year-old gas station worker from Lincoln, Nebraska. Red hair, baby face, soft voice, and a mind twisted by rage and romantic obsession. Starkweather believed the world had wronged him, so he packed a .22 rifle, picked up his 14-year-old girlfriend, Carol Ann Fugate, and set off on a killing spree that left 11 people dead. Can you picture that late 50s stillness? The hum of the radio playing Elvis in the background, the smell of oil and dust at a roadside diner. And out there somewhere, two kids in a stolen car, moving from town to town, leaving blood in their wake. News traveled slower then, but the fear spread fast. Parents started locking doors that had never been locked before. The newspapers called him a modern-day Jesse James, but there was nothing heroic about it. He wasn't robbing banks or fighting the system. He was killing ordinary people. When they finally caught him, his face looked calm, disturbingly so, as if he didn't quite understand what he'd done. He was executed by electric chair the next year, and his story faded, buried under the louder crimes that came after. But if you grew up in those years, you remember the chill. You remember that lesson. Evil didn't need a big city. Sometimes it wore a leather jacket and smiled from across the gas pump. Now, contrast that with today. Back then, a killer's name spread by radio waves and whispered warnings. Now, you'd see it in 100 viral clips before breakfast. You wouldn't wait for the evening news. Your phone would buzz before the first victim's name even reached print. Doesn't it make you wonder if fear used to travel slower, but sink in deeper? Next came Richard Speck, a name that made every woman in America double-check her lock before bed. It was July 1966, Chicago, a hot, heavy summer night. Speck, a drifter with a tattoo that read, "Born to Raise Hell," broke into a townhouse where 8 student nurses lived. One by one, over hours, he tied, tortured, and murdered them. Only one woman survived, by hiding under a bed, frozen in terror. When she finally came out, shaking, the silence in that room was something the country would never forget. You can almost feel it, the hum of the fluorescent light, the smell of blood and bleach, the sound of a single breath after hours of horror. And here's the haunting truth. Speck didn't seem like a monster from a movie. He was just another man you'd pass on the street, with that same hard edge so many wore in the mid-60s. The war, the economy, the pressure, it broke people in quiet ways. But Speck, he snapped, and when he did, the entire nation realized that terror could come from the most ordinary-looking man alive. Imagine that world compared to today. No DNA databases, no digital surveillance, no cell phones pinging his location, just a face on a sketch, and cops knocking door to door. He was caught almost by chance. After trying to take his own life, his tattoo gave him away to a nurse at a hospital. That tattoo? Born to Raise Hell. It became the symbol of something rotten in the heart of the decade that claimed innocence was still alive. But here's the strange thing. As the years passed, his name faded into the archives. Maybe that's what time does. It sands down the edges of our collective fear. Tell me, do you remember hearing that story growing up? Did your mother ever lower her voice when she mentioned that man from Chicago? And then there was Albert DeSalvo, the so-called Boston Strangler. Between 1962 and 1964, 13 women in Boston were found murdered, strangled, often with their own stockings, arranged in poses that made detectives' stomachs turn. The city was in panic. Women carried whistles, hardware stores ran out of deadbolts, taxi drivers refused to pick up passengers at night, but DeSalvo wasn't caught. Through modern forensic genius, he was caught because he confessed, not just to one murder, but to all 13. Yet even his confession didn't quite fit. Some still argue he wasn't the real killer at all, that the true strangler was never found. Can you imagine that? Living in a city where no one knew if the monster was truly gone? The feeling of unease was everywhere, a whole city holding its breath. Housewives who once trusted the milkman now peeked through the curtains before unlocking the door. DeSalvo himself looked disarmingly normal, clean-cut, polite. That's what made it worse. Evil had learned how to hide in plain sight. And when you think about today's true crime obsession, podcasts, documentaries, endless theories, you realize that those stories from the 60s were the foundation of everything we now consume for entertainment. But back then, it wasn't entertainment, it was real fear, breathing in every living room. So let me ask you, if you'd been alive in Boston during those years, would you have opened the door when someone knocked? Or would you have turned off the light and waited for dawn, heart pounding, praying it wasn't your turn? You can almost feel it now, can't you? The atmosphere of those mid-century streets, the lamplight glowing gold on the wet pavement, the hum of a distant jukebox, the faint smell of cigarette smoke curling through the open window of a passing car. On the surface, it was a time of politeness and post-war optimism. But beneath that calm, there were shadows. One of those shadows belonged to a man the papers called the Mad Bomber. His real name was George Metesky, and if you lived in New York City between the late 1940s and 1950s, you remember him, or at least the fear he caused. Metesky wasn't like the others. He didn't stalk or strangle or shoot. He built bombs, crude, pipe-like devices, and placed them in train stations, libraries, theaters, and phone booths. 33 of them over 16 years. Can you imagine that? 16 years of not knowing if the seat beside you, the trash bin near your feet, might hide something that could tear the world apart in an instant. He wasn't motivated by money or madness in the traditional sense. He was angry at the Con Edison Power Company, his former employer, over a workplace injury and the denial of his compensation claim. And in that anger, he found purpose. Metesky wrote letters, furious, taunting the police and newspapers. His handwriting was polite, even formal, like a man writing to an old friend. "I will make them pay," he said in one letter, signing off with, "Yours truly." You can picture it. A 1950s newsroom, cigarette smoke thick in the air, typewriters hammering away, editors hunched over the latest letter from the Mad Bomber. New York became a city of whispers, subways half empty, movie theaters less crowded. Fear had a schedule. Every ticking sound became suspect. When the police finally found him in 1957, living quietly in Waterbury, Connecticut, they discovered a man who seemed more bitter than insane. A clean, polite, middle-aged bachelor in a tidy house. He even apologized as they handcuffed him. The arrest photo looked like any ordinary man you'd pass on the street, but in his basement they found the blueprints, the tools, and the neatly labeled bomb parts. Think about that. A man with no modern technology, no online manifesto, no audience, just anger, patience, and paper. Today, he'd have 1,000 followers online by lunchtime. But back then, fear traveled through word of mouth. It was slower, quieter, but it lingered longer. And then, there's the man who became the ghost story of every small town, Ed Gein. If you grew up in the late 50s, you might remember hearing about the Butcher of Plainfield. It started with whispers, missing women, a strange farm on the edge of town, and a man who never seemed quite right. Gein wasn't a flashy criminal. He was quiet, almost gentle. But when police entered his farmhouse in 1957, they stepped into a nightmare. The house smelled of rot and something else, something worse. Lampshades made of human skin, bowls carved from skulls, furniture upholstered in flesh, and in the shed out back, the body of a local woman, decapitated, hanging upside down like a butchered animal. It was horror beyond imagination, and yet it became the seed for Psycho, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs. You see, before Gein, the world didn't really believe that such evil could come from an ordinary farm boy, but there it was, tucked away in the cornfields of Wisconsin. People from miles away drove to Plainfield just to look at the house. The town turned into a grim carnival overnight, curious crowds, gossip, reporters. But locals never forgot. For them, it wasn't entertainment, it was the night their innocence died. Now compare that to how we treat horror today. We binge watch true crime documentaries with popcorn. We turn monsters into memes. But in the 50s, those stories were whispered with shaking voices. People still believed in good and evil, and they prayed they'd never have to see which one their neighbor truly was. Next, let's talk about Martha Beck and Raymond Fernandez, the so-called Lonely Hearts Killers. It was the late 1940s when their crimes began, but the story carried its dread into the 1950s. These two met through personal ads, the kind printed in the back of newspapers that began with words like "widow seeking companion" or "gentleman of means seeks lady for conversation." It was the old-fashioned version of online dating, only far more trusting. Raymond, a smooth-talking con man with slick hair and a false charm, seduced lonely women for their money. Martha, desperate for love and fiercely jealous, joined him. Together, they became something far darker than either could have been alone. They traveled from town to town, answering ads, gaining women's trust, then robbing and sometimes killing them. You can almost see it, the modest living rooms filled with floral wallpaper, the smell of home-cooked meals, a woman smiling shyly across the table at the man she thought might finally end her loneliness. She didn't know that behind his smile was death. They were eventually caught in 1949 after murdering a widow and her child. At their trial, reporters couldn't look away. It was the perfect scandal. Sex, deception, and murder wrapped in polite 1950s packaging. Martha was overweight and insecure. Raymond was arrogant and manipulative. Together, they looked like the death of romantic innocence. They were executed in 1951, their last words defiant, almost tender. But what lingered wasn't the crime. It was the realization that the letters people once sent with hope could become invitations to death. It was the end of trust, in a way, and that's something people rarely talk about. How much trust defined that era? You left your doors unlocked. You trusted strangers, salesmen, the milkman, the postman. And yet, those very habits were what the predators exploited. By the 1960s, America was learning to close its blinds and look twice at every friendly face. Then, there was Charles Whitman, the man who changed the meaning of the phrase mass shooting. It was August 1st, 1966, Austin, Texas. The air was hot and thick, the kind that makes the world shimmer. Whitman climbed to the top of the University of Texas Tower with a sniper rifle and began shooting. For 96 minutes, he turned the campus into a war zone, killing 16 people and wounding 31 others. Before that day, no one in America had a mental image of what a mass shooter looked like. Whitman created that image, a clean-cut young man, educated, polite, former Marine, with demons no one had noticed. His story wasn't simple. The autopsy revealed a brain tumor pressing against his amygdala, the part of the brain that controls aggression. Maybe it was biology, maybe it was despair, but whatever it was, he changed the country. Police began to rethink emergency response tactics. Cities began preparing for active shooter situations. And the public, they lost something that day. The illusion that violence was random or distant. When you think back, the 60s weren't just about protests, love, and music. They were about watching the last bits of innocence crumble. The monsters were no longer hiding in shadows. They were standing right in the sunlight. And yet, as the decades passed, most of these names vanished from our collective memory. We remember the celebrities, the musicians, the inventions, but not the darkness that shaped the way people locked their doors at night. You see, the 1950s and 1960s taught America something profound. Evil wasn't always a stranger. It was sometimes the man next door, the woman down the street, or the young couple smiling in a photograph. When you close your eyes, you can almost feel that era. The buzz of fluorescent lights in diners, the sound of an old rotary phone, the paper-thin curtains fluttering in a summer breeze. A time before 24-hour news, when terror came not from the screen but from silence, from the knock at the door after dark, from the unmarked car parked too long on your street. And yet, somehow, people endured it. They went on living, loving, believing in good, because they had to. So tell me, when you think of those years, what do you remember? The innocence, or the quiet dread that hid beneath it? Because there's more, much more. The forgotten faces, the ones whose crimes rewrote small-town America, whose stories shaped the laws and fears of the decades that followed. If the small-town killers of the 50s and 60s taught America to lock its doors, the mobsters taught it something deeper. That crime could wear a suit, shake your hand, and smile for the cameras. You remember how the 1960s felt. That crackle in the air between glamour and danger, neon lights over smoky bars, Sinatra on the radio, the scent of expensive cologne and fear mingling in the night. The mob wasn't just in the movies. It was real, breathing, alive in Chicago, New York, Las Vegas, and for a while, it looked untouchable. One of the biggest names in that shadow empire was Sam Giancana, Momo, to those who dared say his name out loud. Giancana wasn't some street thug. He was a businessman of blood, running Chicago's outfit with a kind of cold charisma that blurred the line between crime and politics. He started as a getaway driver in the 1920s, but by the 50s, he controlled everything from gambling to labor unions to politicians' secrets. He threw lavish parties where Hollywood stars brushed shoulders with men who'd killed to sit at that table. Rumor had it he even dated some of them, including, as whispered in smoky corners, a certain woman named Marilyn Monroe. But it wasn't the affairs that terrified people, it was the reach. Giancana's hands stretched all the way into Washington. There were whispers that the CIA had used him to help plot the assassination of Fidel Castro. Imagine that, a government agency and a mob boss working side by side. The 1950s and 60s were full of those contradictions. America preached order, morality, decency, while beneath it all, power and crime were shaking hands. Giancana lived like a king but died like a warning. In 1975, he was found in his kitchen, shot in the back of the head while frying sausage. 7 bullets, one for each betrayal he might have made. His murder was never solved. You can picture that scene, a kitchen light humming softly, the smell of breakfast still in the air, and silence, the kind that feels like the end of an era. Compare that to today's criminals, who brag on live streams, who chase attention like oxygen. Back then, power didn't flaunt itself. It hid in plain sight, behind tailored suits and unlisted numbers. But Giancana wasn't the only one to bleed into the mythos of that golden decade. Another name, just as feared, was Albert Anastasia, known as the Lord High Executioner. He ran murder inque starm, the enforcement arm of the mob. His men carried out hundreds of hits across America, always silent, always efficient. Anastasia was the embodiment of old-school terror. Smooth, unflinching, a man who treated death like business. By the mid-1950s, he was one of the most powerful figures in organized crime. But power in that world was a temporary luxury. On October 25th, 1957, he walked into the Park Sheraton Hotel barbershop in Manhattan. It was a ritual. Same barber, same chair, same routine. He leaned back, a towel over his face, warm shaving cream on his chin, and then the door opened. 2 men walked in, guns wrapped in towels. They fired 10 shots. Anastasia tried to rise, spinning toward the mirror in confusion, and in his final moment, he lunged toward his own reflection, thinking his killers were behind him. He collapsed there, in a pool of shaving cream and blood. That image, a mob boss dying beneath the barbershop lights, became an instant symbol. You probably remember seeing it on the front page of the newspapers, black and white, the photograph blurred but unforgettable. It told the whole country one thing: no one, not even the untouchable, escapes the code. Now, picture the contrast. Back then, people bought that newspaper, folded it under their arm, and carried it all day. They talked about it at lunch counters, in offices, in whispers. News had weight. Fear lasted. Today, it would be a push notification, glanced at and forgotten before your coffee cools. But there's another kind of story from that era, one that didn't involve mobsters or masterminds, but ordinary men caught in extraordinary darkness. Do you remember the names Richard Hickok and Perry Smith? In November 1959, they walked into a Kansas farmhouse and killed 4 members of the Clutter family, Herbert, Bonnie, and their 2 children. No robbery gone wrong, no passionate motive, just the cold, planned killing of a family who'd done nothing but live decent lives. They thought the Clutters had a safe full of cash. They didn't. When it was over, they'd killed for less than $50. What makes that story endure isn't just the crime, it's what came after. Truman Capote's In Cold Blood turned their murders into the first non-fiction novel, painting the killers not as faceless monsters, but as broken human beings. It was the moment America began to look differently at crime. Not just as horror, but as psychology. Still, for the people who lived through it, it wasn't literature. It was the moment they realized the world was changing, that anyone could open their door one night and meet death face to face. You can almost smell that Kansas air. Dry wheat, gasoline, the creak of wooden floorboards. You can hear the ticking of the clock in that farmhouse before the gunshots shattered the silence. For years afterward, people in small towns started double-checking their locks. Some never stopped. And isn't that what defines the 1950s and 1960s in hindsight? The duality. America looked like a postcard. Chrome cars, milkshakes, Sunday smiles. But beneath the gloss, something darker pulsed. Giancana's bullets, Anastasia's blood, the Clutter's farmhouse. All pieces of a mosaic showing how fragile the dream really was. Now, let's talk about another kind of criminal. The one who didn't carry a gun, but whose very name could empty a room. James Bulger, better known as Whitey Bulger, first cut his teeth in the late 1950s Boston underworld. Back then, he was just a neighborhood tough, running bookie operations and street rackets. But even then, people said he had that look. Cold eyes that saw everything and trusted no one. He would rise to power in the decades after, but the seeds were sown in those years when corruption ran like blood through every system meant to prevent it. The 50s and 60s were a breeding ground for men like him, those who realized that rules were just words if you could buy the people who enforced them. It wasn't just about violence anymore. It was about manipulation, leverage, politics. Crime had gone corporate, and while all this unfolded, the media was changing too. Television was becoming America's mirror. Crime wasn't confined to local papers anymore. It was televised, dramatized, nationalized. That's why the mobsters of the era looked larger than life. They weren't just criminals. They were characters in a real-time saga the whole country watched. Think about it. We remember the names of movie stars and presidents from that time, but not the criminals who shaped the system from behind the curtain. Maybe that's because we wanted to believe the dream of the 50s and 60s more than we wanted to face its ghosts. But the ghosts never left, and the closer you look, the more you realize that the so-called forgotten criminals didn't just vanish. They became the blueprint for modern crime. They taught us what organized fear looked like, how trust could be weaponized, how society could hide its darkness behind a clean smile. If you were alive back then, you remember the feeling. Every story on the radio seemed to hum with tension. A missing child, a mob hit, a mysterious explosion. It felt like the whole world was teetering between innocence and something we couldn't yet name. And when you look back now, through the haze of nostalgia, it's easy to forget how revolutionary those years were. Law enforcement was still learning. The FBI didn't even have national databases. Fingerprints were manually matched, and cross-state communication took days. Criminals like Giancana or Hickok could vanish for weeks simply by hopping a bus. Contrast that with today's surveillance-heavy world, where every face is traceable and every message leaves a trail. There was a strange kind of power and anonymity then, the freedom to disappear, for better or worse. But with every disappearance came a cost. For every headline that faded, there were families who never forgot, small towns that never felt safe again. And that's why these stories matter. Because they're the undercurrent beneath the American dream. They're the reason your grandparents locked their doors. The reason small towns learned to fear strangers. The reason we still crave stories about justice, revenge, and the monsters who look just like us. Now, before we close this chapter, let's pause here. Imagine yourself back in that era, 1963, maybe. You're sitting in a living room with patterned wallpaper and the smell of coffee in the air. The television flickers with grainy images, Kennedy's speeches, civil rights marches, space launches, but beneath it all, there's a different kind of story running silently. The quiet crimes, the forgotten names, the ones people tried not to talk about but never truly stopped fearing. In the next and final part, we'll bring it all together. The forgotten gangsters, killers, and conspirators who helped America grow up, lose its innocence, and build the foundations of modern crime solving. Because by the time the 1970s rolled in, everything had changed, and it was these ghosts from the 50s and 60s that taught the world what darkness really looked like when the lights were still on. By the time the 1960s began to fade, America was no longer the same country it had been at the start of that decade. The colors looked brighter on the surface, psychedelic patterns, new cars, new hope. But beneath the music and the movement, there was something deeper, a quiet awareness that innocence was gone for good. Because those years had taught people a hard truth. Danger no longer wore a villain's mask. It could smile at you across a diner table, it could shake your hand, ask for directions, or deliver your mail. The monsters of the 50s and 60s didn't just haunt police blotters, they rewrote the rules of trust itself. And if you grew up in that time, you remember it. The shift was gradual, like watching a familiar room grow darker each night without noticing when the last light went out. There was one final layer to that darkness, the conspiratorial kind, the one that whispered that even the most powerful men could fall to bullets. And that's where Jack Ruby enters the story. November 24th, 1963. The world was still raw from the assassination of President John F. Kennedy 2 days earlier. America was in shock, a country mourning, glued to their television sets. Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of killing Kennedy, was being transferred from the Dallas City Jail. And then, in front of millions of live viewers, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped from the crowd and shot Oswald point blank. For the first time in history, the nation watched a murder live on television. The silence afterward was suffocating. You could almost hear it, the gasp, the disbelief. One moment, justice was supposed to take its course. The next, it was snatched away in real time. Jack Ruby wasn't a trained killer. He was a man known for his temper, his connections to the underworld, and his nightclub that catered to cops, reporters, and small-time mobsters. But that moment blurred every line between crime, politics, and performance. Was it vengeance, conspiracy, madness? No one could agree, but it changed America forever. People stopped believing everything they were told. They stopped trusting every official story. The 1960s would end with that same uneasy feeling that someone, somewhere, was pulling strings behind the curtain. And when you think about it, that's where the modern age of suspicion began, with one man and one gunshot broadcast to the entire world. But while Ruby's act burned itself into history, another name from that era became the whisper that outlasted even the loudest headlines: Zodiac. The Zodiac Killer terrorized Northern California from the late 1960s into the early 1970s. He wasn't caught, and that's what made him different. He didn't vanish because of a capture or an execution. He vanished because we never found him. He wrote letters to newspapers, taunting the police with cryptic ciphers and boasts. His handwriting became as infamous as his name. "I like killing people because it's so much fun," one letter began. It wasn't just cruelty, it was theater. He wanted an audience, and he got one. Imagine living in San Francisco in those years. The sound of foghorns at night, the hum of neon signs downtown, and somewhere out there, a man who could be anyone. A stranger's glance in a diner suddenly felt like a warning. The Zodiac turned fear into a performance. He was the bridge between the faceless evil of the old world and the media-saturated terror of the new one. The idea that crime could be not just an act, but a story, that it could live in headlines, conversations, and memory. And even though we still don't know who he was, we all remember what he made us feel. The truth is, by the end of the 1960s, crime had changed, but so had we. The country that had once trusted easily was now learning to analyze, question, protect. Because of people like Charles Starkweather, we learned that killers could be young. Because of Richard Speck, we learned that safety could be shattered in one night. Because of Albert DeSalvo, we learned that evil could smile politely. Because of Ed Gein, we learned that horror didn't need imagination. Because of Sam Giancana and Albert Anastasia, we learned that even respectability could hide rot. Because of Jack Ruby, we learned that truth itself could be messy. And because of Zodiac, we learned that mystery never really dies. Every one of them left a scar on the American psyche. A lesson, a warning, a quiet change in how people live their daily lives. After those decades, people bought deadbolts for the first time. They left porch lights on all night. Parents started warning their kids not to talk to strangers, a phrase that hadn't even existed as common advice before. Law enforcement changed too. The FBI began building national databases. Forensic science advanced. Criminal profiling, once unheard of, became a tool born from the chaos of trying to understand men like Starkweather and Speck. And yet, despite all the fear and tragedy, something else emerged: resilience. The human instinct to adapt, to learn, to find safety again. You might remember how, by the early 70s, the tone of the country had shifted. People were no longer shocked that evil existed. They were determined to understand it. Books, documentaries, court trials, all became part of a cultural reckoning with what the 50s and 60s had revealed. That was the strange gift of those 2 decades. They made the invisible visible. They pulled back the curtain. Because before that, America had believed, in tidy endings, the bad guy gets caught, the sheriff saves the day, justice is clear. But after the 60s, everyone knew better. The world was complicated, motives tangled, truth and deception intertwined. Even Hollywood reflected it. The clean heroes of the early 50s gave way to the gritty anti-heroes of the late 60s and 70s, a reflection of a society that had lost its blind faith but gained awareness. When you close your eyes and drift back to those years, you can almost feel it. The grain of the wood under your fingertips on a living room radio, the smell of evening rain on pavement, the faint echo of a news anchor's solemn voice through static. Another killing, another arrest, another name. And you realize that these weren't just stories of crime. They were stories of how people learned to navigate a changing world. The crimes of the 1950s and 1960s didn't just fill headlines. They filled the spaces between trust and fear. They reshaped how we defined safety. They carved invisible lines in our culture, teaching us to look twice at what we once took for granted. It's strange, isn't it, how we forget the names but remember the feeling, the tension, the shift. Maybe that's the real legacy of those years. Not the crimes themselves, but how they changed the rhythm of daily life. How they made entire generations more cautious, more observant, more aware that the world wasn't as gentle as it once seemed. So as you sit here now, decades later, think about this. The next time you double check your lock before bed, or walk a little faster down a dark street, or hesitate before opening your door to a stranger, that instinct didn't come from nowhere. It came from history, from a time when America had to grow up fast. The 1950s gave us the illusion of safety. The 1960s tore it away. And in between those years, in the headlines we've long forgotten, lie the ghosts of 10 names. Men and women whose actions forced an entire nation to see itself clearly for the first time. You can almost hear them now, the echoes of those old newscasts, the click of a typewriter in a newsroom long gone, the whisper of pages turning in yellowed newspapers. They may be forgotten, but their shadows still walk beside us, in our laws, our fears, and our need to remember what safety really costs. And that's what nostalgia really is, isn't it? Not just remembering the good, but remembering what it took to get here. So tell me, when you look back on those years, the headlines, the tension, the way the world seemed to tilt just a little more each day, what do you remember most? The innocence we had, or the price we paid for losing it? Because somewhere in between those two things lies the story of America, written not just by the heroes who built it, but by the criminals who forced it to change. And maybe, in the end, that's why we keep revisiting those names, the ones that time tried to erase, because part of us knows that forgetting them would mean forgetting the lessons they left behind. The sirens fade, the headlines yellow, the names disappear, but the echoes remain, in every late night thought, in every whispered warning, in every quiet, nostalgic breath that says, "We survived." And maybe that's the most human story of all. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.